And thank you, all of you, for coming. We have a full house here, and I know there was a great hearing last week with the chairman's colleagues. I wish I could have been there. I was with my family, but we had people there. And so we have a lot of interest right now in the internet expansion issues in Minnesota. We're very excited. And thank you, Allison, for that nice introduction. I will say that it is nicer than the one I got a few months ago from the chief judge of our federal district court, where he gave me this big introduction at the swearing in of our new United States Marshal, and there were about 500 people there, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I give to you Minnesota's senior citizen." It's true. That's what happened to me. So, but I would like to thank our panelists. They'll be up here shortly for joining us. Chairman Genachowski for making the trip out here today. He got on a Delta flight at like 6 in the morning in Washington after being at the Washington Nationals game last night. I thought that was a good fact, and is excited to be out here, and especially at the University of Minnesota, which always has been such an incubator for new ideas, and at the beautiful building we have here at the Carlson School. As I was driving in this morning, I was looking around and saw a number of students probably getting ready for class and registering and things. And of course, some of them had their Blackberries, some of them had their cell phones. And it occurred to me how different their college experience in terms of technology was probably compared to mine. When you think about it, most of today's freshmen at the University of Minnesota were born in 1992, the same year that IBM introduced the ThinkPad laptop, and just 1 year after the World Wide Web became available for public use. Well, I thought back to when I was in college as I went through the university today. I will admit, a decade before many of these freshmen were born. And I remember, this is a true story, being one of the first non-computer geeks to learn the labyrinth of the Yale Computer Center. Literally, I took 3 days of training so that I could type up my senior essay, and I went a mile. I would walk every day to the one computer center to work on it. And the computer people that worked there didn't really like the infiltration of non-computer people, and they could somehow control the screens centrally in the computer center. And for a joke, they would do things like turn my screen upside down while I was trying to type in my senior essay about the Dome Stadium. I did have the last laugh because I got that whole essay typed in. I was able to edit it. I got it published, and I finished much more quickly than my fellow students, and then embarked on the not-so-lucrative career because I had this special know-how of how to use the computer, of typing in other Yale students' senior essays for $1 a page. So that's it. So we all know that the days of erasable paper and whiteout are long gone. And just about every college kid knows how to use a computer, and it's no longer just for typing term papers. With the internet, they have the tools to contact anyone at any time via email, IM, and remember, I have a teenage daughter, text messaging. So there's no question that the internet has fundamentally altered the way we communicate, and it hasn't stopped there. It has revolutionized every corner of American life, transforming the way that we conduct business, provide health care, and learn in schools. And I'm convinced that the internet is, in fact, the infrastructure challenge of our time. Just as we worked to bring electricity and telephone service to every home in the 1930s, we're now working to bring high-speed, affordable internet to every home in America. In America right now, more than 230 million people have access to the web. Household broadband adoption has grown in recent years, up from 47% in 2007 to 66% in this year, 2010. Still, those figures remain lower for people living in rural areas, and we have work to do in expanding access for all Americans, regardless of income. But access is not the only issue at stake. For Minnesota, which placed 44th out of 50 states in a 2008 study on internet speeds, speed is also a huge concern, as is cost. When you talk to people in rural areas throughout our states, people whose only option are either paying hundreds of dollars a month for high-speed internet or using dial-up that is so slow it barely works, you appreciate the need for an improved broadband infrastructure. Too many of our state's families, hospitals, and businesses have been left behind. For the grandmother in Roseau who is forced to wait 2 hours to download a digital photo of her grandchild, high-speed internet access would allow her to see those photos right away. For the cancer patient in Lac qui Parle who is forced to drive hundreds of miles every month to see the closest specialist, a fast broadband connection would give him access to telemedicine, allowing him to consult with a doctor from the comfort of his living room. For the entrepreneur in Cook County who currently can't meet clients on the other side of the country without buying an expensive plane ticket, high-speed internet would mean he could meet those clients face-to-face with an online video conference. Or the Leech Lake tribal person who doesn't have access to a community computer center, who has to access and learn how to use the internet. These are just a few examples of the power of high-speed broadband to change people's lives. We all know it is a critical tool in the 21st century for our teachers, our business leaders, and for public safety. And like any other infrastructure project, it also holds enormous potential for creating jobs. By one estimate, every 1% increase in broadband deployment sparks the creation of some 300,000 jobs. That's a Brookings Institute estimate. I don't know about you, but I want those jobs to go to places like Minneapolis and St. Paul, or Windham, or Crookston, and not to Mumbai, Hong Kong, or Beijing. Remember, we are the country that brought the world the internet. We are the birthplace of the PC, of YouTube, of iPod, of Kindle. Our state has always believed in innovation. We brought the world everything from the Post-it to the pacemaker. And we are now 7th in the country for Fortune 500 companies while being 21st in population, in part because we believe in innovation. We are home in this country to a number of game-changing technologies that have harnessed the power of the web to change the way that we live and work, from the way we run our businesses to the way we read books, listen to music, and manage our money. But in recent decades, we have fallen behind. Out of 57 industrialized countries, the US now ranks 23rd for access, speed, and affordability of the internet. Our average connection speed is 4.7 megabytes per second. To put that number in perspective, the average speed in South Korea is 33 megabytes per second. It's like much of the world is whizzing by in flashy new sports cars, and too many parts of America is still puttering along in Model Ts. When I think about the challenges of competing in the world economy, I'm always reminded of the opening ceremonies in the Beijing Olympics, those Summer Olympics. I remember watching them on a fuzzy TV with my family and seeing those 2,000 perfectly synchronized drummers and thinking, we are in trouble. Well, those drum beats are only getting louder and louder and louder. America can no longer afford to be a country that sits on the sidelines waiting for the next wave of innovation to crash on its shores. We need to be a country that is perpetually thinking, doing, and moving forward. In the words of New York Times columnist and Minnesota native Tom Friedman, we need to do some nation building in our own nation. Now, how do we do that? I believe that we begin with an innovation agenda, a roadmap that charts a new course for American competitiveness, progress, and invention. For one, we need an education system that trains our students in critical math and science courses and allows talented foreign-born students who study in our universities to stay here after graduation so that the next Microsoft is born here in America, not India. We need policies that encourage invention, like a strong, stable R&D tax credit and a streamlined process for commercializing university research. We need an increased emphasis on exports, not only for the 3Ms and Cargills of the world, but also our small and medium-sized businesses, as 95% of our potential customers right now in this country are outside of our borders. And we need to be building a nationwide high-speed broadband network that lays the groundwork for entrepreneurship, job creation, future technology breakthroughs, and communication on the grassroots level. Because at the end of the day, we can't expect to lead the world in new technology if our innovators don't have the tools they need to research and develop. We can't expect the next wave of Apples and Amazons to crop up in our country when we don't have the internet framework to support them. Expanding broadband is not only the infrastructure challenge of our time, it is also the innovation challenge of our time. And if we don't effectively extend its reach, we will fall behind. I know that Chairman Genachowski is going to speak about the FCC's National Broadband Plan and the national efforts to expand high-speed, affordable broadband to all corners of America and to ensure that we have net neutrality. For the past decade or more, our businesses and communications workers and average citizens have been crying out for such a plan, and thanks to the recent work of Chairman Genachowski and the other commissioners at the FCC and the team in place there, that debate is finally happening in this country. Now, I want to first talk about what we're seeing in Minnesota. We've made a start here. So far, a number of the local groups that applied for broadband grants through the Recovery Act have been successful, with a lot of promising applications, and I know there's some in this room that are still in the wings. I just want to give you a few examples of what we're dealing with. There is Grand Rapids, the Grand Rapids-based Blandin Foundation, which is here with us today. With its broadband grant, the foundation is going to touch 80 rural communities, encouraging broadband adoption in both homes and businesses. In fact, its goal is to help 2,000 small businesses gain access to high-speed broadband and technical training in areas like e-commerce. Then there's the grant that's going to connect Minnesota's rural police stations and county sheriff offices with online law enforcement tools such as fingerprint databases. Through the same grant, 12 rural healthcare facilities will be better connected to the Mayo Clinic's headquarters in Rochester. With the help of high-speed Ethernet connection, providers at these clinics will have access to remote medical training, while patients in these clinics will have access to telemedicine services. We also have the grant that the Farmers Mutual Telephone Company will put at work in Lockheed Parle. Through this investment, Johnson Memorial Health Services, which is here with us today, will be able to provide more efficient patient care through telemedicine. We're also seeing a large investment in southwest Minnesota, which is going to build on the success of the high-speed service already available in Windham. With this grant, that service will be expanded to reach 8 of Windham's surrounding communities, including Jackson, Lakefield, and Round Lake. In doing so, it's going to bring high-speed internet into thousands of homes and businesses, including 300 homes and businesses that up to this point only had dial-up service. So Minnesota is taking very real steps toward building the communications infrastructure that was outlined in the Minnesota Broadband Plan that we need to create jobs, improve connectivity, and spur innovation. The question is no longer if we need fast, affordable broadband, but when we will get it. We're seeing progress, but there are still roadblocks standing in the way, as Bruce Kerfoot from the Gunflint Lodge will tell you today. And there are decisions left to be made, and I know we're going to delve into some of those many issues this morning. As we continue to work to get broadband to all Americans, we will have to address these challenges head on. Just as importantly, we will need to have a clear understanding of what's at stake and where our priorities need to be. As we move forward, I believe that we have 3 fundamental bases to cover. First and foremost, we need to be sure that the internet remains open, secure, and accessible to consumers. As many of you know, as I mentioned, Commissioners Clyburn and Kopp came to Minneapolis last week to discuss this very issue. As they smartly put it, we need to make sure consumers maintain control over their online experience. I couldn't agree more. Second, and the focus of our discussion today, we need to be sure broadband is expanded in such a way that strengthens our innovation economy and opens the door to renewed job growth, while at the same time ensuring net neutrality. And finally, we need to encourage investment in the kind of streamlined, cutting-edge infrastructure that will keep our country competitive in the global economy. To do this, we need to create an environment that allows the government and business to work together effectively. These priorities must be pillars in any blueprint for expanding broadband access, and I look forward to discussing them further with our panelists today. I know we have a great group assembled here, and I'm very happy that Chairman Genachowski will be giving our first keynote address. Chairman Genachowski has an extensive background working on innovation issues. He has served as FCC chairman since June of 2009, a job he took after more than a decade in the technology area. During his time in the private sector, Chairman Genachowski worked as both an executive and an entrepreneur. He has also served as a clerk for United States Supreme Court Justices Souter and Brennan, and spent time working as a congressional aide for both then Representative Chuck Schumer and the Select House Committee investigating the Iran-Contra affair. Chairman Genachowski, we are truly honored to have you in Minnesota today, and we are looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the National Broadband Plan and its implications for Minnesota and the country. Thank you. Please join us.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to the University of Minnesota for hosting this today, and to the Carlson School. Thank you to all of the panelists. Very much looking forward to hearing your input on broadband policy as we move forward. Thank you to everyone here for coming here, participating in this broadband summit. It's a great time to be in Minnesota. Yes, I did get up early to come here, but I'm told that 6 a.m. is not early in Minnesota, so I take no credit for that. It is a great time to be here. Brent Favre is in camp. The Twins are in first. The T-Wolves, well, did I mention that Brent Favre is in camp? Senator Klobuchar, thank you for inviting me to be here. We can make this very brief, and actually, when you boil down my remarks, they really amount to this, what she said. But I'm going to thank you all for your patience anyway, and I'll touch on some key points about broadband. But I do want you to know how vital a role Senator Klobuchar plays in Washington on these issues. Now, it's not a surprise to those of you here, and for people who know Senator Klobuchar's background and familiarity with technology and telecom and law enforcement. It's not a surprise that Senator Klobuchar has emerged as a real leader in Washington on these issues. Senator Klobuchar played an important role during the development of the Recovery Act in making sure that broadband was part of the plan for recovery, the plan for economic recovery. You just heard from Senator Klobuchar about some of the grants that Minnesota has already received from Commerce and the Agriculture Department, a number of terrific programs that go to both infrastructure building in areas where there isn't broadband infrastructure, and also in adoption and training and addressing the full ecosystem around broadband. I'm looking forward to hearing more about some of these programs and ideas on our panel, as I know we will a little bit later. One other note about Senator Klobuchar. I was reading a little bit in advance of the trip, and I noticed that there's a Washington Post story that calls Senator Klobuchar, quote, the funniest new member of Congress, to which I say, game on, Senator Franken. So we're here at the Minnesota Broadband Summit. Senator Klobuchar outlined the topics. Let me start at the beginning. What is broadband? Why should it matter? A year ago, 2 years ago, and still today, a lot of people aren't even really sure what broadband is. Well, of course, it's high-speed internet. And it is, I believe, as important to the U.S. in the 21st century as electricity was in the 20th century. Indispensable infrastructure that is and will reshape our economy and our lives. So broadband first is our 21st century platform for economic opportunity. Studies show that even modest increases in broadband adoption spur economic growth and create jobs. There's no question that broadband is essential to the success of small businesses, opening up new markets where small businesses can sell their products, helping small businesses lower their costs through services that are available on the cloud, vital to small businesses. As I travel around the country and learn about examples, we heard some of them before, we'll hear some of them on the panel, but whether it's a butcher in rural Nebraska that, because broadband was available in its community, was able to sell its products outside of its home market, triple its revenues, double its employees in a short period of time, even in this economy. Or a farmer in Pennsylvania who I met who said, when I grew up, the last thing that I thought had any relevance to what I do are computers and connectivity. Today, farmers can't do their jobs without broadband. So economic opportunity, broadband is essential. Civic participation in the 21st century, freedom of expression, the ability to participate in government, improving government services. Our information grid will be essential. Solutions to major challenges like healthcare, education, public safety. All of these rely on a healthy, robust broadband ecosystem. All of these opportunities, economic growth, opportunities for small businesses, for education, for healthcare, are particularly important in rural America when you think about broadband. And particularly important for us to develop policies that tackle the real opportunities and the real challenges. Let's talk about challenges. The U.S., I just saw this, I was looking at the Minnesota Broadband Plan, and it has some terrific charts, and some of you may have heard these numbers, that show that the U.S. is lagging globally when it comes to broadband. And so the Minnesota Broadband Plan has tables that show OECD studies that rank the U.S. In the plan, I think it was 15th. Since then, we've dropped to 18th, according to the OECD. There are other studies that show similar statistics. There's some people who say maybe those studies aren't apples to apples, but I have to tell you, you can discount that by a half, and it's not good enough. There's another study that I'd like to mention briefly because it concerns me a lot, and it informs a lot of what we're working on at the FCC. This is a study that looked at 40 industrial countries and ranked them, including the U.S., on a series of metrics relating to competitiveness and innovative capacity. And broadband was a key part of those metrics. That particular study looked at some other things, our education system. That particular study ranked the U.S. 6th out of 40 on a snapshot basis. And some of you are saying, oh, 6, that's not so bad. Well, I disagree with you if you think that. But that's also not what's really important about this study. The study then looked at each of these metrics and measured the rate of change in these metrics. All the countries were getting better on broadband, but it measured the rate of change. And on that metric, the U.S. ranked 40th out of 40. And this is what should concern us as we think about our economy in the 21st century. Standing still on broadband is falling behind. One other point that I think is important for people to understand. I talked about the opportunities of broadband for creating jobs, for getting healthcare remotely to people who don't have specialists in their community, education, whether it's remote tutoring, connecting schools with teachers, a world of information that's on the internet. Let me for a minute talk about the costs of digital exclusion. One of the reasons that I think it's so important that Senator Klobuchar called this summit today and so important that there's the focus on broadband is that the costs of digital exclusion are rising. And so 5 years ago, 7 years ago, if you were looking for a job and you didn't have access to the internet, it was a problem, but you could probably find the job posting and you could probably figure out a way to apply for the job. Today, if you're looking for a job and you don't have access to the internet, you're at a real disadvantage. More and more job postings are moving online. We know this. Some of our work showed that among our largest companies in the United States, more than 3/4 of them are doing all of their job postings online. And they're requiring people to submit their job applications online. None of this sounds crazy, unless you don't have internet access. And then you don't have the opportunities. If you don't have digital skills, you don't have a chance. The costs of digital exclusion are rising, and we need to tackle it. You can think about this from a small business perspective. Some of the examples that the Senator and I have talked about, whether it's a butcher or a bakery or others, examples of companies that are using the internet to advance. Well, 10 years ago, if you were a small business and you weren't on the internet, okay, we can debate how much of a problem that was. Today, it's not a debate. If you're a small business and you don't have broadband access, if you don't have broadband skills, you're at a competitive disadvantage. You're at a real disadvantage. And we need to tackle those issues. As we studied broadband, we found really two sets of problems, and we'll come back to these, I think, on the panel. There are parts of the country that just don't have broadband infrastructure. It's a minority of the country, but it's over 24 million Americans who have no broadband at all. And there's a significant number here in Minnesota that just have no broadband infrastructure. Even if they wanted to connect, they couldn't. Senator Klobuchar mentioned our national average on broadband adoption. About 66% right now. Too low. In a world where Singapore is at 90%, where we need everyone who participates in our economy, in our education system, in our healthcare system to have broadband access, it's too low. If we're going to lead the world in economic growth, investment, innovation, and job creation in the 21st century, we need broadband that is fast, affordable, and open. Achieving these goals, including preserving internet freedom, is essential for consumers, entrepreneurs, small businesses, everywhere. Internet users, not service providers, should be deciding what content and services they get when they go on the internet. Entrepreneurs, innovators, whether there's someone with an idea for a new business or a small business that has an idea for expanding their existing business, need to be able to access an open internet to be able to participate and thrive in a 21st century economy. So for these reasons, I was very pleased that Senator Klobuchar called this summit today. I was pleased that the event last week included Commissioner Copps and Clyburn. There are many issues around broadband that we need to tackle. I was glad that Senator Klobuchar, as I mentioned, ensured that the Recovery Act contained funding for broadband grants. But as Senator Klobuchar and others know, the funding that was set aside in the Recovery Act was not enough to meet the broadband gap that we have in the country, to really address the deployment issues, the adoption issues, the digital literacy issues that we have. And so in the Recovery Act, Congress also tasked the FCC with developing a national broadband plan. Should have done it years ago, but Congress did it, the President signed it, and the FCC worked very hard to develop a national broadband plan that we released just a few months ago in March. It's an ambitious strategy to promote U.S. leadership and ensure that every American can enjoy the benefits of broadband. The plan lays out goals for the country, goals around pursuing a 1 gigabit anchor institution that's publicly available in every community in the country, 100 megabits to 100 million households by 2020, taking our adoption rate from 65%, 66% to 90% in the next 10 years, which, by the way, would be a faster curve than we had for telephone service in the country. Some people thought these goals were just way too ambitious. But I think they're goals that we need to work to hit. Now, the plan has a series of concrete recommendations on infrastructure deployment, adoption, the development of a whole series of innovative solutions to national challenges. Let me touch on a few of them here. We'll probably come back to others during our session. Let me start with something that we all know is increasingly important to our mobile ecosystem, and that is mobile broadband. You know, the farmer who cares about broadband, well, they want broadband when they're at a desk, but they also want and need broadband when they're on a tractor in a field. We have the opportunity to lead the world in mobile broadband innovation. We have to tackle the spectrum crunch that's coming, and the broadband plan proposes recovering 500 megahertz of spectrum over the next 10 years. It's important that we tackle these spectrum issues so that we lead the world in mobile broadband innovation. The plan has a series of recommendations around lowering the cost of broadband deployment to incentivize deeper, faster broadband build-out. And so at the FCC, we moved on one of them already, our tower siting proposal that will speed up the ability to site towers. The plan recommends, and we weren't shy about borrowing good ideas, but the plan recommends that we move forward on the idea that Senator Klobuchar has introduced in Congress, dig once. If we're digging up a road anywhere in the country, in a world where we know that some of the biggest costs to deploying broadband is the build-out itself, we've got to lay the conduits, we've got to lay the fiber at the same time. Now, to make sure all Americans can access affordable high-speed internet, one of the most significant recommendations in the plan is to transform what's called our Universal Service Fund from supporting telephone service to broadband. So this is something that may be not that familiar to people who are growing increasingly interested in broadband, but we have a program in the United States. It's called the Universal Service Fund. It's about $8 billion a year. And it's done a very good job over the years helping universalize telephone service. Well, we've got to transform that to support broadband service. It's complex, it's not easy, but we have to do it to make sure that broadband reaches rural America and that the other parts of USF are all transformed to apply to broadband. To ensure that all Americans have access to 21st century health care, the National Broadband Plan recommends, and we have started to move on, transforming what had been a pilot program to connect rural hospitals, clinics, family doctors to broadband. As many as 1/3 of rural healthcare clinics don't have access to broadband. And so to get the benefits of broadband in healthcare, they just can't do it. We need to tackle that. And so much is at stake here when you think about it, and some of you may be here from rural parts of the country. I was in Oakland, California a couple of weeks ago, and I saw a pretty vivid example of what this can mean. At the Children's Hospital in Oakland, they have specialists, including pediatric cardiologist specialists who, well, they're specialists. They have the skills that specialists have. And we participated in a demonstration where there were parents in a rural California town and a newborn who had heart issues and was in a hospital where where they didn't have the kind of cardiac specialists who could treat this infant. Now, we can imagine the parents driving the infant back and forth for 3 or 4 hours. Or we can imagine a world where we saw what I saw, which is they took the echocardiogram, kind of the ultrasound of the baby's heart, in the rural town, and the specialist in Oakland was able to read it on the screen and provide the kind of medical assistance that you would want. I've seen this with infants. There's a disease that causes blindness in newborns that's treatable. If doctors who are the specialists in this have to travel around, as they do now, to lots of different hospitals, there's just a limit to how many infants they can see, diagnose, and treat. Well, with broadband, and I've seen a demonstration of this, the doctor can stay back in his or her hospital, and with broadband and the right devices, they can diagnose the infant remotely. I've seen places where cancer patients, chemotherapy patients, instead of having to travel back and forth over a 6-month period where they might need 12 chemotherapy treatments, back and forth 3 or 4 hours, 12 times. I saw one hospital where they've started to have the patient travel just once at the beginning, once at the end, and the chemotherapy is administered remotely in between with a local medical technician and a remote cancer specialist providing guidance remotely. You look at these things, and I suspect that you think what I think, which is these examples, which are now the exception, should be the rule in the United States. And that's what we're trying to achieve with our broadband plan. Education, I'll mention that briefly. The FCC has, in one area over the years, developed a plan to harness some of the opportunities of the internet, and that has to do with education. There's a program called the E-Rate program, which has done a good job over the last number of years, thanks to the work of Senators Rockefeller and Senator Snow, Congressman Markey, and others who've been pushing this for a long time in connecting schools to the internet. And so interestingly, while rural healthcare clinics, where there hasn't been the focus, are at, and even the data here isn't very good, but say 67% penetration, schools are actually way above 90% in internet connectivity. But there are a series of reforms we need to put in place to make sure that the E-Rate program is working for the 21st century. Making sure that it works for the communities, that it supports faster speeds, that it supports various different technologies. Finally, public safety. The opportunities of broadband to support our national goal recommended by the 9/11 Commission of making sure that we have an interoperable national mobile broadband network for our first responders. It's critical. This is one where it's not going to get built by itself. We do need Congress to step up and to say this is an area where we need to make an investment, and we need to do it soon, because if we can build out the mobile broadband public safety network while commercial providers are building out 4G, the next generation of wireless, we can have significant cost savings. We can save lives and save money for the American people if we move on this soon. Let me stop here and emphasize how important these broadband goals are for the country. Again, it's a word that people are only beginning to understand, broadband. But the role that it will play in our economy, healthcare, education, public safety in the 21st century can't be overstated. The challenges to tackling these are also very high. But it's critical that we all work together to make sure that we're not just making slow and steady progress here, but that we recognize that we are in a global competition for leadership on innovation and investment, and that we take this as seriously as we've taken other major national challenges and move forward together. With that, again, I thank you all for including me today. I look forward to hearing from the panelists, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, well, why don't we have the panelists come up? I'll introduce them, and I hope everyone's starting to write their questions, because we'll gather them in the next 10 minutes or so I can go through them while we are looking at having the panelists finish up. And you can pass the cards to the sides as you do that. Okay, very good. Well, I'm going to introduce everyone together, and then they're each going to speak for 5 minutes, and then we will turn to the most important part here, which is your questions of the chairman and the other panelists. First up, we'll have Bernadine Joselyn, who is the Director of Public Policy and Engagement at the Blandin Foundation. Since 2003, Bernadine has led Blandin Foundation's efforts to promote broadband in Greater Minnesota. Bernadine played a pivotal role in securing a grant from the Commerce Department that will help provide computer centers and computer education throughout the state. Next to Bernadine is Rick King. Rick is the Chief Technology Officer for Thomson Reuters Professional and Legal Divisions. Rick is wearing 2 hats today. In addition to his work at Thomson Reuters, he also chaired Minnesota's Ultra-High-Speed Broadband Task Force and wrote the Broadband Report for our state. In addition, Rick was honored as Minnesota's 2008 Technology Executive of the Year by Minnesota High Tech Association and was named to Computer World's Top 100 Leaders in the IT list for 2007. Then we have Pam Lehmann. Pam is the Executive Director for Parle County Development Authority, which received a Commerce Department grant this year to bring broadband to more than 3,700 people, roughly 165 businesses, and 12 community institutions. After Pam is Tim Lovaasen. He's the president of the Minnesota Communications Workers of America. Before taking on his work at CWA, Tim worked for over 37 years in the telephone industry for Northwestern Bell, US West, and finally Quest. Tim was also a member of Minnesota's Ultra-High-Speed Broadband Task Force. And I will say that nationally, the communication workers have been pushing the speed issue with Internet and expansion of Internet for many years. Last but not least, we have Bruce Kerfoot, the owner of the Gunflint Lodge Resort in Grand Marais, a place that my family has visited, and my dad has brought hundreds of sort of sweaty bicyclists in the past. Bruce has helped lead the effort to get broadband in Cook County. He's worked very hard for the Gunflint Trail Historical Society and also heads up the Helping Hand program for disabled veterans in the Grand Marais area. With that, I will turn it over to Bernadine, and we'll hear from our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Good morning, everyone. And we really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this summit here this morning to talk about this very important topic. Broadband has been high on Blandin Foundation's agenda for more than 5 years. Our Broadband Strategy Board agreed to a statewide vision and set of principles for Minnesota back in 2005. And that vision calls on our state to make the necessary investments to become a world leader in the universal deployment and use of ultra-high-speed next-generation broadband. To help achieve this vision, we're now in the midst of implementing our NTIA BTOP Sustainable Broadband Adoption Program that the Senator mentioned, that we call Minnesota Intelligent Rural Communities. We received $4.8 million of federal funds for the stimulus grant, and our partners, together, we're providing a $1 million match. We're seeing tremendous innovation and collaboration among our growing list of partners, and some of you are here in the audience today, and it's good to see you here with us. Blandin Foundation became committed to broadband because we understand that this new infrastructure, this new essential utility, is critical for the future of rural vitality. Chairman Genachowski called it the indispensable infrastructure. Jobs, education, healthcare, community quality of life, all of them are increasingly dependent on the availability and the use of this emerging technology. I've been impressed by Ford Foundation President Ubinius's recognition of an even broader and more fundamental role for broadband. In a recent article in Chronicle of Philanthropy, he called broadband a gateway to democratic participation, economic opportunity, and human expression. Our foundation and our experience of trying to do this work in rural Minnesota over the past 5 years has led us to believe that we need to take a holistic approach. We see 3 specific prongs or approaches to helping increase the utilization and availability of broadband. First one is focusing on networks and the need to plan for and deploy telecommunication networks that reach all of Minnesotans. Number 2 is building demand for broadband and encouraging and enabling broadband users, regardless of their age, their income, their educational level, or the language that they speak. And we need to overcome barriers to application development and implementation across sectors in our state: healthcare, education, government, service, and business. Building demand is the core strategy that the foundation has been pursuing in our work through market development activities. And this means, of course, increasing subscribership and the sophistication of use of those people that subscribe to broadband. There's lots of benefits to increasing subscribership, growing that pie. It improves the markets for telecommunications investments, which is very important in our market economy. It allows community institutions to reach their members over a network rather than through printed materials and mail, which saves costs and improves efficiency. And it enables a greater percentage of end users to access that information online. So how are we doing in Minnesota in terms of subscribership? Well, I'm really pleased today to be able to share some fresh data right out of my computer that has just been compiled by our Merck partners at the University of Minnesota Crookston and the Center for Rural Policy and Development that have just completed a new statewide broadband survey to give us a snapshot of subscription rates in the state against which we can benchmark our work in applying these federal funds we've received. And here's what we've just learned, and these numbers apply only to greater Minnesota, to rural Minnesota. So what we found out is that 75% of rural residents in our state have a computer at home. And of those, 94.5 of those home computers are hooked up to the internet, and 91% of those connections are broadband connections. So what all that adds up to is that 64% of greater Minnesota residents have broadband access at home. 64%. And, you know, numbers alone, I always say to my son, so compared to what? Well, 64% compared to 2001, only 6% of rural residents had broadband access at home. And as recently as 2005, when we began this work, 27%. So we are seeing significant growth in rural broadband access. But what it adds up to is that the market for those computers with broadbands in the home is pretty saturated. The challenge, of course, is that with almost 95% of rural computer owners already online and on 92% of those connected by broadband, there isn't much room for growth in terms of broadband demand among people that have computers. All things remaining equal, once we get to 100% of all rural computers online connected with broadband, we've still got about 25% of rural households that are completely offline. So the most obvious strategy to address this gap is to focus on those households that don't even have a computer at home, to figure out the barriers to computer ownership and address them. And those barriers, as many of us in this room are aware, are largely age and income. Those are the two big barriers. In Minnesota, over 85% of folks that are 55 and younger have a computer at home, compared to less than 40% of people that are over 65. And in terms of income, while more than 87% of those making over $50,000 have a computer, only 42% of those making less than $25,000 do. And so Chairman Genachowski spoke very eloquently about the cost of digital exclusion, and I think that is something that we'll look forward to talking more about as we get into dialogue with our audience. Before I close, I've been asked to just make a few observations about the challenges and opportunities connecting healthcare and broadband. And we have invested in a couple of very innovative healthcare projects through our resources in Staples. Lakewood Hospital is doing telehealth for post-surgical and chronic health monitoring. A pharmacy in Age Adrian is using telepharmacy to connect with Worthington, and in Winona, Home and Community Options is using broadband to monitor and reduce costs and improve services. So there's a lot of innovation right here in our state that we can look to show the impact that broadband can make on this important sector. The key challenge and opportunity in healthcare, of course, is the demographic shifts. We're seeing an increasingly aging population that is going to demand more healthcare services, and without the networks to deliver them, we won't be able to do the job that we're capable of doing. I just would like to close by saying how excited we are at the foundation to see all the innovation and collaboration that's emerging thanks to the stimulus dollars that Senator Klobuchar helped bring to our state. And I wanted to commend to all of you the opportunities that those funds will mean for rural people across the state, and we look forward to working with you over the coming years to put those federal tax dollars to good use to grow the demand and the ability of Minnesotans to benefit from broadband networks. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much. Rick King.
Thank you, Senator, Chairman, and panel members. It's great to have this event put together, and I commend you for the leadership, Senator. I've been part of statewide initiatives like Broadband Task Force because my experiences have given me the opportunity to see what's possible through innovation and technology in markets and economies big and small. For me, the experience gained through the task force and community activities accentuated the true values of smart, innovative, and global workforce coupled with communications infrastructure that's needed to share these ideas and the products of the ideas with economic markets worldwide. So as we approached the role of writing the report, and I, the chair of that, we had a different perspective. We had 23 people. We had a great opportunity to see how to collaborate together, and I'm very proud of the whole task force. We were able to get to our end result without a single vote. It was all by consensus. If you want to take 23 people from different walks of life and get them to agree on something, I think that's a phenomenal result. The result was something that says, in 5 years, we want this state to be in the top 5 in the United States for speed, for broadband penetration, and in the top 15 for broadband penetration globally. You heard from the chair where we are today. We're not there. We're not there. Many people do think we're better. Many people think the U.S. is better than we are, but we're not there. As you heard earlier, today Minnesota ranks about 23rd when it comes to speeds in the nation. That's almost not above the middle. Don't we always claim we're above the middle? People told us, too, that these goals are aggressive, and some people said that they're not aggressive enough. And I think when I heard equal complaining about them on both sides, I realized we had the right goals. The task force also called for something that I think is really important. We set minimum thresholds. That is, everybody has to have access, and everybody has to have access at a certain speed. I applaud the goal of shooting for very high speeds, which the federal plan has in it. That is absolutely perfect. We need ubiquitous broadband at a minimum level so every single citizen can access these vital services that will run across the pipe, the broadband infrastructure coming up. And we heard about them. The chair talked about and the senator talked about healthcare, education, and somewhat about government. These healthcare and education are two of the biggest opportunities that we have. And all we hear every day is how much money we spend on those two and how ineffective they are. Broadband can transform them by providing more for less and help in a lot of ways, as indicated. This is truly the technology, the expansion. It's the way to deliver goods and services in the 21st century. There's all kinds of statistics that you can find. I don't find any statistics that don't show that job growth isn't inextricably linked to broadband availability as a whole. Job growth is 2.5 times more prevalent in areas that have effective broadband than not. Department of Commerce. In addition, jobs will be created by installing and developing broadband infrastructure, and we've seen that, and that's one of the good benefits of the stimulus package in itself. And speaking of that, in Minnesota alone, stimulus package totals to date, including last week's grants, $140 million poured into the state, primarily through great institutions like the Blandin Foundation and some of the great county applications and the great individual applications that came through, most geared toward going after that 6% in Minnesota that do not have access to broadband. That is about 100,000 homes that don't have access, 300,000 individuals out there. If you take the interest of companies, I'm actually asked quite a bit because I work for a large company, why do you spend time on this? Why does a company like Thomson Reuters care? Don't you just buy whatever you need? The answer is, for the company, yes, and we pay a lot of money and we have a lot of friends in the telecommunications business. But to tell you the truth, it's more about things that we do with our employees and creating an environment economically in the state around where we work that's vibrant, that brings in technology workers, that brings in other companies. It's the economic development that's really key to us. And we want our workers to be able to do every single thing that they can do from the office at home. And that requires a certain type of infrastructure to deliver those services. Because we use a lot of video, a lot of different applications have to be up on somebody's computers in order for our people to work at home. And fundamentally, that's something that all large employers think about because they want to be the best place to work for the current workforce, the new emerging high-tech workforce. The second thing large companies think about is business continuity planning. What if you can't go into your office and do your work? Because you know what? There is nobody in the world except in Minnesota who cares if Minnesota has a flood in my data center or in my office. They still, in New York City, expect to access our services. They don't care what kind of calamity took place. So I've got to have people that can be home or in other locations that can do everything that they can do from the office. That's why big companies are interested in this. But it's not just an issue for big companies. As I said, Greater Minnesota education opportunities and healthcare opportunities. Think of how we can equate the good healthcare delivery that takes place in southern Minnesota and bring it north. I want to leave you with just a couple of facts to further illustrate my point. I'm sure you're aware that for a number of years, Minnesota has been one of the leaders in goods and services delivery. The goods and services of the 20th century took roads and planes to move around the country and be sold in market. The 21st century goods and services are emerging to include things that are information-based and data-based. We need to be able to have the information highway move those goods and services around. The Minnesota Ultra High Speed Broadband Task Force recommendation offer Minnesota clear benchmarks for achieving broadband leadership, job leadership, and economic leadership that can be modeled for the whole nation. I'm optimistic that our state has and will continue to have governing leadership that will embrace the economic opportunity that broadband leadership stands to provide, and I look forward to seeing our state's potential truly unleashed through broadband expansion. So with that, thank you again, Senator Klobuchar, for inviting me here today. Thank you to the chairman for coming up to Minnesota. And I look forward to the rest of the discussion here with all of you and the other panel members. Thanks.
Good morning. I just want to take a moment and thank Senator Klobuchar for all her efforts. You know, the support of quality broadband for residents and businesses in Minnesota and around the country, it's invaluable to us. So I want to really thank you for that. And it's an honor to be invited to speak here today. The Parle County Broadband Initiative started in 2007, and there were several key players that got this rolling. And we ended up with this large grant that was announced recently. But the key players included Blandin, And without the help of Bill Coleman, who's here today, we wouldn't have been able to head in the direction that we did. Some of the other very important key players are here today as well, including Eureka Broadband and Kevin Byer from Farmers Mutual Telephone Company. And then in addition to that, the buy-in from a group of very rural, farm-grown county commissioners to understand the potential of what broadband could do for a very small county. So I want to make sure that we thank all of them as well. For those of you that don't know, Parle County is a rural county in west central Minnesota, and our population is under 8,000. When the new census data comes out, we're assuming that that's going to be significantly lower. What we anticipate, though, is that in another 10 years, because of what's happened here in the last month, we will see an increase instead of a decrease in our population. As of today, Farmers Mutual Telephone, a locally owned rural cooperative, has deployed fiber to the premise technology to every one of their customers. That's about 25% of the residences and businesses in Parle County. And that's a very unique situation. And it's because of this advanced vision shown by Farmers Mutual Telephone that we developed this public-private partnership, which is pretty unique. And that is where everything got started to apply for the broadband stimulus dollars to spread fiber to the premise to all of Parle County. On August 4th, we were awarded $9,652,956 in a grant loan funding from the USDA RUS program. The impact of this $9.65 million project will be felt for generations in our small county of Parle. At the start of the initiative in 2007, our initial goal, our initial dream, was to be the first county in Minnesota and one of the first counties in the country to be completely fiber to the premise. We didn't know if we could attain that goal, but we weren't going to be willing to settle for whatever the local providers were willing to offer our small rural county. Now that we've been funded, we know that in addition to what Farmers Telephone has already deployed in Parle County, at least an additional 165 businesses, 12 community institutions, and 1,800 residential homes will have access to fiber optic services. That will mean we'll be reaching over 5,000 of those residents in Parle County. As we launch this project to become one of the leading technology counties in the state, we're very confident that in the near future we'll see an influx of new businesses, a lot of expansion of our existing businesses, new healthcare initiatives, expansion of educational pilot projects, entrepreneurial ideas we expect to bloom and grow. Telecommuters will become the norm because we offer a great location to live and a wonderful quality of life. Telehealth options will improve, as will e-commerce and more. At where we stand today, we have a lot of very, very small rural businesses that have little to no web presence whatsoever, and we can see that increasing over the next few years. These changes will then generate an increase in population, and that increase will increase business for our local retailers, enrollment at our local schools will increase, employment opportunities will grow, membership in local organizations which are dwindling and kind of starting to flounder, we expect them to start to blossom and grow as well. Participation in area arts and humanities events will improve, as will appreciation for our many outdoor activities and attractions. As this cycle of technology advances, we're confident good things will continue to happen and ensure the sustainability and growth of our very small rural county in west central Minnesota. Similar to the efforts taken by those who worked so hard to get electricity and telephone service to rural parts of the state and the country several generations ago, what we're undertaking in this project will continue to impact our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren for far into the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.
Also, I'd like to thank the Senator and the Chairman for this opportunity. As they said, 37 years plus ago, well, it's longer than that now. I retired about 4 years ago from, at that time, Quest. But when I started with the phone company, the big thing that we were pushing at that time was touch tone. So you can see that we've come a long way. And at that time, we felt that we were, and probably were, the greatest phone company in the world, that being AT&T, which was the parent company. And I've watched some things happen over my years at the company that is very similar to what's going on now. We were the best. We provided dial tone to everyone. But in some cases, that dial tone was on a party line system. So in about 1973, they took a bunch of us out to Buffalo. We'd made the improvements out there, and we started improving their system so they were able to have private lines. Now, not everybody took a private line because they didn't want to pay that price, but they at least went from 8-party to a 4-party to a 2-party to 1-party, whatever they wanted to buy. And I think that's some of the things that we on the task force saw, is that people want higher speeds, but they're not exactly sure they want to pay for the increase that it will take to increase some of these speeds. So I just put that out there as, you know, to think about some of the things that we're hearing about. Things have to be super fast right away, and I don't think that's something that's absolutely possible right away, and that we'll have to build this out in steps. And one of the things that I know, that, you know, Rick did a great job keeping the task force on task and not getting off on what I would call were some of the elephants in the room that have to be discussed and have to be settled if we are going to move forward. Now, one of the things I saw at the telephone company in my years, many things happened that changed us from being number one to maybe where we're at today. And one of the things I felt, in my opinion, that affected it was divestiture. Divestiture of the phone company was created a lot of competition. A lot of people felt that was good. Another thing that happened in the 70s that was AT&T was told they could not go into cable television. Now, if you looked at it today, where we're at, cable television and the telephone companies have moved to where they provide both. And if you don't think that's true, I just was up at my folks, and they live just in a little town called Vergas, Minnesota, which is up in the northwestern part of the state, kind of circled by Perm, Fergus Falls, and Detroit Lakes. They are now getting what's called IP television. Their television is coming over their phone line. They have 17 megabits of service, which is pretty dang good. So what I'm trying to tell you is both of these technologies are together, but they're regulated different. And that tends to be a major problem. And that brings up the problem of the Universal Service Fund. That has been funded by telephone users. And I know there's a lawsuit going on that was started by Comcast. It's over net neutrality. Sometimes I wonder if that's what it's all about. They got people fired up on that. So I want to read to you what we feel has to be done to the communication workers. And as the Senator said, the communication workers of America have been at the forefront through Speed Matters. We know that this has to be done. These speeds have to be reached to do all the great things that everybody is talking. This has to be done. But to get there, some hard decisions are going to have to be made. Some people are going to have to take some tough stands to get the job done. So, CWA supports a narrow, targeted legislation to clarify the FCC's authority to promote universal, affordable broadband and open internet. 1, make clear that the Federal Universal Service Fund may be used to support broadband build-out and programs to encourage broadband adoption and use for low-income households. And that would be the folks that I felt that we really had to address on the task forces, those in the rural areas that the provider of last resort in most cases is the telephone company, but because they are, regardless of the size of the phone company, have to be able to use these funds because they are in competition with the cable companies in the bigger metropolitan areas, and that's where they're putting their money, and that's why the services don't go out to the smaller people like Bruce is going to tell you about. Second, establish that the FCC open internet principles as the law of the land. Ensure that broadband internet service providers do not prevent users from sending and receiving the lawful internet content of their choice, running lawful applications and services of their choice, subject to the needs of law enforcement and connecting their choice of legal devices that do not harm the network, all subject to reasonable network management. Require broadband internet access service, application, and content providers to make available to consumers transparent and accurate information in a widely spoken languages, including Spanish, about the capabilities and network management practices of their offering. And third, ensure that the broadband internet providers do not engage in unreasonable discrimination against any lawful internet content, application, or service that harms competition or consumers. This means that broadband internet service providers cannot make exclusive deals. And fourth, ensure that minority business and entrepreneurs are given meaningful opportunities to participate in the build-out of the high-speed networks. And this is not only supported by CWA, but by the NAACP, the National Urban League, the League of United Latin American Citizens, the AFL-CIO, and the Sierra Club. It's going to take a lot of money to build out this system. I believe the estimated cost is around $350 billion. 5 times of that, or I mean, about. I got to see how I can say this. Of the money put out there, the industry is going to put out 5 times more than what the government is going to be out there putting out. We are going to have to work together. And one of the things I said on the task force is we're going to have to collaborate between the providers and the cities and the counties that are applying for federal grants and the use of universal service money. If we don't collaborate, we will have more competition introduced, and it will take more money to do what we want to do, and a lot of things will fail. And we had a couple of consultants tell us that about this, that we have to have collaboration. So with that, I'll end.
Thank you, Senator. You didn't get me quite mixed up with senior citizen, but it's probably a phrase that will haunt me for a while since it was a good one that she quoted earlier. But thank you for the opportunity to be here today, representing one of the companies, a small company in Minnesota that's in the trenches and is on the receiving end of some of what we have out there at the moment in which the environment in which we have to do business. And as, you know, if this group was reflective of where we were going nationally, it would seem like we're already on our way. We haven't had any argument or disagreement to speak of at all. And if we could just transmit this enthusiasm to the majority in Washington, we'd probably be off and flying. But as was stated earlier, in general circumstances anyway, this strikes me as a moment that we've really hit kind of our third economic key development plateau of recent years. We've had the interstate road system, we've had the electrifying of America, and now we got the telecommunications of America. And it really is of the same magnitude and significance, and those that ran ahead of us and made those huge leaps of faith in those earlier commitments are the type of threshold that we're looking at right now with what we got ahead of us in this issue. And it was brought to my mind very succinctly not long ago when I was planning a bit of a vacation, and fortunately my wife and I sneak away now and then for something interesting in the shoulder seasons. And I was looking up, and darned if I couldn't, in very quick order, like maybe 2 minutes time on the internet, I had made a reservation at the Hotel Lagorno in the Lagorno village of Switzerland, a little itsy-bitsy village up north of Milan. 2 minutes. Now, there isn't one person in Europe that can make a reservation with me in any length of time because of the limited telecommunication services that we have between us. This is tough picking. But that's a good example. That's a small little inn, not too different in size of our own property, in a very remote village in Switzerland. Wow. And then we look abroad further, and I read not long ago, well, it's months ago now, but the whole country of Finland has made the commitment that they will have broadband to all of their citizens. They either have it now or will be very soon. And broadband to them is real broadband. And I think we have a little bit of confusion here in Minnesota because we've been sort of sold a bill of goods by the providers that are presently out there in that the satellite systems have attempted to convince us that they're offering us broadband service. And that's the premise with which some of us have participated. But it's really half-baked broadband service. It's better than slow dial-up, but it isn't there. And I think there's a bit of confusion when we start to look at statistics of those that have broadband service, because many that receive satellite consider or have been told that they have broadband, and they really aren't there because it does not meet the needs of where we're all at. Today, as I look at the reason I'm here, I guess, is I'm reflective of a small business person here in Minnesota. Our family has had the company for 80 years. We've got about 50 employees, and we're out in the outskirts of Minnesota, up that beautiful north shore of Lake Superior and up near the Boundary Waters for the momentary commercial that you get here from me.
You don't need the internet. Now everyone's going to call your thing because it sounds so nice as we're sitting here.
Anyway, we have very slow dial-up. In fact, it's so slow that it's a joke, so none of us use it because it's over 50-year-old wires that don't function from that purpose. We have satellite with limited band opportunity. And boy, you run through that rather quickly, no matter if you buy their gold package or not, and it doesn't have the speed nor dependability. And that is a tough nut to crack and to do business in this environment. And as we all know, when we look at the internet, we've got both professional and personal needs. And sure, we all know that there's businesses outside of the city limits, and there's farms, and there's resorts, and there's tourism. And obviously, I speak to you more with the examples at hand for me as it relates to tourism, because that's been my profession for years. But when you get over to the continued personal needs, you've got the educational uses, which of course we all understand. And you know, the statistics are interesting, but earlier, as a panelist cited, we have a wonderful, or the beginnings of a good track record of the number of schools as a percentage within our state that are served by broadband. But within that, we've got the students that come to those schools and those students at home that can't participate in the broadband in which to do their homework or their research. Their school is wired, but when they get home, they have no ability to continue to do their homework with those assets. So it doesn't seem to me as though that first number is all self-providing, in that we still have a huge gap out there in that regard. When it gets to the professional needs, I mean, when you hit the trenches here now, this is some fairly significant issues that really are haunting us. And I speak more from an operational point of view of telling you what's happening out here. I don't have lofty numbers and all kinds of fancy statistics. But when it hits the trenches, most of our people these days use credit cards. Now, 95% of transactions in the leisure industry are in credit card transactions. You know, that is all telecommunicated instantly. And when you use intermittent service, or what I would consider the beginnings of intermittent service, it's tough picking when people are ready to check out and you can't process their credit card and they begin to feel foolish because, you know, they're wondering why, what have you. Or right now we have a mandated state fishing license program. Guess what? That goes through those kind of lines too. half-hour waiting for your fishing license is not a joke to a fisherman that's convinced the fish were biting when he couldn't get out there. Online reservations are a total impossibility to us in a lot of outside the city limit type of businesses. And in recreation and tourism, it's deadly. For instance, I haven't had a foreign visitor this year. I can't compete. You go to a committed community like Banff up in Canada, 50% of their guests are Japanese. 50% are coming through bookings on the internet, and they have made a commitment of their community to seek out the international traveler, and it has been an economic salvation to them. Well, this issue is well beyond what any of us can do individually or within our respective communities, and it really has to become a national priority. We've got the beginnings of help appearing with different grants and gifts that are coming to Minnesota through the hard efforts of the business community and the wisdom and leadership of our congressional delegation. But we need to look at this, or hopefully find a commitment in the states with a much broader perspective, and that is a national commitment, not just the commitment of our delegation that believes in it and understands it. We need to go in a far broader way. We know we've got a middle grant commitment to our community, and we're seeking for the last one. So we have applications out, needless to say, so that hopefully that we can get back to a competitive basis. This is going to have an extremely long-term impact, and we have come close to becoming second-class citizens and businesses with the lack of this service. So we are going to be continually working the effort, along with our delegation, to see if Minnesota can be better served. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. We have, as you can see, I think everyone in the room asks a question. So I've kind of put them in stacks because a lot of them are on the same topics. And I want to thank you for your participation. And I'll try to direct the questions at one or two people so that we can get as many questions in as possible. Obviously, there were a number of questions of Chairman Genachowski. And I think sort of the summary of people's just urgency, as expressed by Bruce with his story about the tourism business going to Canada because areas are wired and areas aren't wired. And that was, there was a question about if you were Glinda the Good Witch. I thought that was sort of funny. And you could wave your magic wand, how would you get us there as soon as possible in terms of competing internationally and getting the things in place that we need to have internet service for Americans?
Making the deficit go away and being able to print money would help. And I think this has been a very valuable session in reinforcing something that we've heard consistently across the panel, but that as one or two of the panelists said, it's really just beginning to penetrate to a larger audience, that the internet really matters for small businesses like the Gunflint Lodge. They matter for students who want to be able to access the internet at home as well as at school. One of the major challenges we have, of course, is that building out the infrastructure is just very expensive. And a reality that we all have to work on together to confront is in particular communities, it's even more expensive than others because you have to put down more infrastructure and serve fewer people. So I think that there are really a couple of different things that we have to do at the same time, and they're sometimes in tension with each other. Continuing to talk about the outcomes that we want for the country so that this is a national priority, and also wrestling with the complex issues of how do we spur infrastructure, speeds, adoption, given some of the challenges of the economic model. One of the areas where I have real hope is There are some parts of these issues where some of the goals are potentially at odds, and there are some where there are real win-wins. So one example is broadband adoption, moving the country from 65% to 90% and more. This is a win-win because the more people who adopt, the more people who are subscribing to broadband, the more the economic model improves, and over time, that will help. I think adoption is an area that's potentially a win-win. For deployment, we've got to tackle the Universal Service Fund, transform it to apply to broadband, do it as quickly as possible, work with Congress on whether there are ways to do a capital infusion into the fund to bridge the gap so that we can do the transition faster and reach more of rural America more quickly.
Okay, I'm going to just ask some follow-up questions along those ways. The National Broadband Plan has an ambitious goal of having 100 million homes with access to broadband at speeds of 100 megabits per second. However, some have criticized the plan for only supporting 4 megabits per second in rural high-cost parts of the country. Is that fair to rural customers? What are your thoughts?
This is a question that, let me take a step back and explain a couple of things that we did in the plan. One is we set ambitious goals for the country that apply everywhere in the country. 1 gigabit to every community, 100 megabits everywhere. These are stretch goals. As some of the panelists said, there's no silver bullet for any of them. It's going to require the FCC and Congress and state governments and the private sector and innovators to work together to hit these goals. There was another issue we need to address, which is for parts of the country that rely on universal service, where we're going to make a decision as a country that, you know what, in the way that we stepped up and paid to universalize electricity, paid to universalize telephone service, we're going to make the commitment to do that for broadband in areas where the economic model won't support ubiquity. So now we have to decide as a country, well, what does that mean? How much are we going to pay for it? And we spent time trying to analyze that, looking at what the speeds actually correspond to in the near term for uses, whether it's what students need at school, what small businesses need for reservations or other services, what healthcare clinics need for remote diagnostics. Let's identify those core elements of broadband for our economy, for education, for healthcare, and make sure that as we move the Universal Service Fund to support broadband, that we're doing it in an efficient way where we can justify the funding. And on there, we were looking at a landscape of the definition of broadband for these purposes is under 1 megabit now. In other countries that have looked at this issue, what are we going to fund? If they've addressed it at all, they've said in most cases 1, in a couple of cases 2 megabits. We said none of those is good enough for us. We've got to find a way to have the minimum level for funding be 4 megabits. And so that's the significance of the 4 megabit number. And let me tell you, it's not going to be easy to transform the Universal Service Fund to get 4 megabits to the parts of the country that have no infrastructure at all. But that's the goal. And the last point I'd make is that level is an initial minimum for funding. We wrote in the broadband plan that, like the internet, it should always evolve because technology is changing. The internet is changing. And so this initial level that we're looking at for initial funding of universal service is something that would be reviewed on a regular basis. And if and when applications develop so that our small businesses, our students, patients, doctors need more, we'll have to tackle that inside either the Universal Service Fund or other grant programs.
Okay, very good. And this question, I think both you and Bernadine May want to answer this. Many other states and the federal government derive significant benefits from public-private partnerships by aggregating demand. Should local governments and schools in rural Minnesota, for example, create more cooperative purchasing opportunities for broadband services that would create economies of scope and purchasing leverage in order to meet their needs and save money?
The short answer is yes, and I think this is in the category of potential win-wins. To have various parts of our public sphere, whether it's schools, parts of government, focus more of their purchasing power on broadband helps everyone. It helps the ecosystem, and it's a critical part to helping us achieve our goals. And so identifying barriers to those kinds of activities and encouraging them to happen, whether it's at the state or local level or at the federal level. You know, we found in doing our national broadband plan that there are examples of federal agencies that had both paper and electronic systems and were charging people who wanted to do their filing online. Well, that's not the way it should be. So identifying barriers to increasing demand for broadband, removing them, encouraging in a variety of ways increased demand for broadband will have to be part of the strategy to actually move us forward on broadband speeds and ubiquity.
I would simply add that I think in Minnesota we're well positioned to move on that opportunity and strategy. One of the highlights of the Ultra High Speed Broadband Task Force report that Rick chaired was their call for increased public-private partnership. And I think Pam's presentation is also a great illustration of what people can do together that we can't do alone. And so I would simply echo the chairman's comments that given the economics of trying to address especially more challenging markets and the different opportunities and roles that the sectors play, that by working together we can do things that we can't do if we work in isolation. And I was very encouraged to hear provider members of the task force pledge to Minnesotans that they are recognize this imperative and are willing to come to the table to work cooperatively with public sector and other institutions to do a better job of increasing access in hard-to-reach places.
If I could add one other thing to that, Senator, which is finding ways to encourage the rollout and demand for new kinds of technologies that meet some of these needs is going to be important as well. And so again, whether it's the kids at home who need access. There are great ideas out there that we can pursue in various ways. There are some school systems in the country that have put Wi-Fi on buses. And so to the extent that it'll take some time to build out infrastructure to very rural areas, there are ways to actually, for kids who have 1 or 2 hour bus trips to go back and forth to school, to put Wi-Fi there. There are some interesting, innovative ideas that we are looking at very actively to unleash more innovation, more ways to deliver broadband to people at home and on the move. I'll tell you that we're working on some things very hard now. I can't announce them, but stay tuned because there are good ideas out there that we're working on that will help spur innovation and investment in new technologies to meet some of these very real challenges.
A number of questions on whether or not you support net neutrality. Why is it so important? How are you going to ensure it happens? How will you make sure we aren't like China where information about Tiananmen Square is blocked for access? A number of questions about the importance of net neutrality of you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Well, listen, I feel very strongly that we stumbled into something really great in the country when the internet was developed with an open architecture that encouraged a whole series of things that we've seen over the last number of years. Incredible innovation, access to information and ideas. And so this is very important. You know, should consumers and users be able to continue to access the lawful content of their choice on the internet? Of course. Should innovators continue to be able to innovate without permission? Yes. Should providers be transparent, honest about their management practices? Yes. Do we need an enforceable framework to preserve internet freedom and openness? Yes. Some of the issues, as we've heard from some of the panelists, are complex. We're working on them. But these principles are very important.
Okay. What happens, another one of you, what happens to the Minnesota TV stations that wish to remain serving their communities on channels that the FCC now seeks to use for a nationwide broadband service? Will these stations be forced to move to other channels in order to clear spectrum for a nationwide broadband channel? Can you guarantee all stations will have the same service area coverage once you squeeze stations onto fewer channels?
Well, that's a question that probably is going to be a little bit hard to follow for some of the people who don't understand the background. So let me just take a step back. We have a huge opportunity in the U.S. around wireless.
And there are about 4 questions here about wireless, which maybe you can answer later, about the FCC's role in wireless in broadband.
Great. Well, these things come together, so let me tackle them here. You know, for everyone who's using a smartphone or who has played around with the iPad, we know that there's tremendous innovation happening around wireless, and we also know how frustrating it is now to deal with some of the network congestion issues that you know, lead to dropped calls or low quality. We have the opportunity to lead the world in wireless. We know what one of the biggest gaps, biggest challenges to that is going to be, and it's that the demand for wireless spectrum use, because these signals go over spectrum, will exceed the supply of spectrum available. And so one of the most important things that we are working on at the FCC is a plan for spectrum management for the country, not for the next 6 months or a year, but for the next few years and beyond. We're working very closely with Senator Klobuchar and the Commerce Committee on these issues, because we need to find ways to free up more spectrum for mobile broadband. There are no easy pickings on the spectrum chart, and what we suggested in the broadband plan was what we call incentive auctions, a mechanism where holders of spectrum on a voluntary basis can put spectrum into an auction. We can have people bid for it. It's a way, with some of the proceeds going back to the spectrum licensees, it's one of the areas that, that I believe is a potential win-win, where there's an opportunity to put more capital into existing technologies, to free up spectrum, to benefit consumers, and to spur the wireless opportunity in mobile broadband in the United States.
Okay, there is, I guess we'll ask this one of you, Rick. There's questions that most of the investment in broadband stimulus has been for rural or unserved areas, an admitted need. But if Singapore, Korea, Australia, and others are making improvements in populated areas, highly populated areas as well, how do we get ultra-high-speed broadband to cities and job centers to keep our high-tech economy globally competitive? And along that same line, there's a number of questions about suburban areas, and then, of course, for inner city, and that the emphasis on making sure that people are able to get internet, low-income people as well. So just your work with the state task force, and anyone else that wants to join in, Tim, or anyone else on this question.
Sure. Well, you know, one of the great things to look at here, if you go out into a trench in a suburban area or an urban area, you see a lot of wires running in the trench. They serve the same groups. So, you know, I think my premise would be this: if you had the wiring capacity you needed to serve everybody, you could take some out of some of these trenches and put it where there isn't any, and it would all come out the same. You just have to dig the holes. Seriously, some places we just have a ton of competition, and competition is good, but we're all going after those one most competitive areas, and not serving the other areas as well. And that's the conundrum there. It's clear that it's not just the city areas. If you take a country like Korea that's 98% covered with broadband, and you look at the kind of terrain and the kind of weather and the kind of urban and multiple rural areas, just pecked with rural areas. They've found a way to get some coverage out there, and their geography, other than the lakes, is a lot like the geography of Minnesota, only Minnesota has more cities. So theoretically, if you look at a country like that and compare it to a state like Minnesota, we should have better coverage than they do. But they have a policy for a longer period of time that says this is of national import. And frankly, that's where I think it all starts. I'm really pleased that we have a national plan. You can argue with anything you want about the plan. I'm sure it will get better, it does evolve. But the fact is we have a direction, and that direction is going to be very pivotal in taking all the people that want to invest and pointing them in the right direction. And I think with that, and similar in Minnesota, we're going to see people continuing to offer higher speed services over the wires they do have already in the city areas, in the suburban areas, and then we're going to see the build out stimulated by some of the money that's put out there, but also by the opportunity with these things actually being cheaper and 4G offering up to 10 megabits. That's going to be one of the biggest salvations for the rural areas. And when you look at that and you think a lot of rural areas do not have adequate phone service today, they don't have emergency services today, wrap in the partnership idea. If you're putting up a tower for 800 megahertz emergency service bands, that is happening in Minnesota, so everybody has on the same frequencies, why not at the same time deal with picking up the wireless service out there? And at that very time, if you put in what it takes to do 4G, you've just brought cell phone emergency and what we call the minimum broadband capability to that remote location. Once you do it there, I mean, it's only a matter of time before these other places fill in. And the city part, I'll close up with this, is driven a lot by this competition I spoke about, but it's also the jobs. So if you bring in high-tech employers like our company and others, those are the people that make the demands of the current providers to provide the kind of services that far exceed what's done in many of these other countries. It's just not universally available to all the businesses and all the consumers at this point. But once that infrastructure is there, and much of it is, it can be extended out there, I think, fairly readily. So I'm much more bullish about the cities. I'm reasonably bullish about most of the suburban areas, although we see a lot of holes in the broadband maps there. The rural are the dominant of that 6% that's not covered at the minimum speed. And then I think once every place is wired, moving it up speed-wise is a much easier task.
Thank you. And Tim, there was a note here as well. The University of Minnesota received one of the first grants, I didn't mention that, from the Recovery Act with the goal of bringing more adoption and access, reducing the digital divide for communities of color. And I just wonder if you wanted to comment at all about since you raised it with the communication workers, the issue of urban divides and the issues of low-income access.
Well, I would say most of it is financial. I mean, and I think CWA has said over the years that part of this money, very much like what the Brandon Society is talking about, is that we need to put some money aside for education of how to use the internet, and also money we put aside to help people be able to purchase computers so that they can utilize the internet. And that's one of the things that we've felt all along that needs to be done. If I could just add to what Rick was saying, part of what I was trying to say is a lot of times people believe competition is good, and in a lot of cases it is. But the problem is in most of your monies that the companies are now going to be putting in are going to go into areas where they can get a reasonable rate of return. And as long as that is the norm, that's what's going to happen, unless there's exactly what the answer is. But what you really have here is it's look at it like a city that's providing water service to you. You have 2 conduits out there, and those conduits have to bring in money. Now, if there was 1 conduit, we could probably have done it a lot cheaper, and that's what ended up happening through divestiture, and with the cable companies and the telephone companies now competing against each other. They are going to put their resources where they can make a reasonable rate of return. In some of these rural areas where you already see fiber, and in a lot of them, and we heard about it in our task force, they've got fiber out there, or they've made significant improvements in their system where they can utilize the copper that's in existence, feeding it with fiber, and bring higher speeds. But they don't have that competition of somebody maybe overbuilding their town, and they have to respond. And that's one of the things where I know we have to have collaboration. There has to be collaboration in some of these areas, or the process will be slowed down.
Just a few quick questions here, some at me. How closely do Senator Klobuchar, Senator Franken work together? We work together. And I will say our entire congressional delegation has worked together on this. It tends not to be a partisan issue, as more of an economic issue. There's questions about when will the monies from the stimulus actually make it to the field? And I'm going to spare the chairman this, because actually the money is going to be given out by the USDA, as you know, a big chunk of the grants, as well as the Commerce Department. But I'm going to volunteer Tim Molino up here with my office in Washington for any specific questions about grants and what's happening with grants. He's sitting in the front row, so you can talk to him when we're done. Questions about corporate contributions to politicians, and I can assure the 3 people that wrote on this, no one cares more about this than me, that had to work so hard to raise money for my campaign that I set the all-time Senate record of raising $17,000 from ex-boyfriends. And so I would assure you that I am on the Durbin bill, which looks at a very important bill to look at changing some of the financing to look a little bit more like how Minnesota does it on a statewide basis. And I think I give this, there's a grouping of questions that maybe Pam, since you're on the front line in a rural community, and anyone else that wants to join in, Bruce, anyone, about how can we promote education? How can community governments and how can states promote education so people understand how to use the internet when given that rate that the chairman mentioned of 66, 67% of adoption? What focus should be given to education on the internet?
One of the things that I can say from experience when we started with this, it's getting down to the basics and just defining what is broadband. Hopefully my mother doesn't hear this, but when we started this project and started talking about broadband in a rural community, farming is really the norm for everything. And my mom said, broadband? Is that a new chemical they're going to use on the fields? and so I think there's a lot of the folks that aren't making use of computers and understanding what we're working on and what we're going to be deploying just need to be educated, and I think that's going to take time. We've been working on classes along with our, this big grant, of course, was the ultimate goal, but we didn't stop there. We've been offering education classes for the past 3.5 years for businesses and residents, and that's going to continue. Tomorrow we're deploying a mobile computer lab that's going to go around and offer free access to computers, internet service, and training to everyone. So we just need to find creative ways to get out there and educate these folks.
Bruce, you're an organizer. You can get at this education question if you want, but I also was wondering how you're in an area, you're dealing with Washington, you're dealing with the state and trying to make your case, and how do you think on a grassroots level citizens should be focused in order to make the case for broadband, because you've got to get the entire citizenry engaged to get this done.
That's a two-pronged here, because the first question underlying is how do we get them into this loop? All you have to do is have kids and give them the facility or the ability, and they're so damn far ahead of the rest of us that they will lead the pack and they will drag mom and dad along and show us where our mistakes are and get us on focus with some of this. Many of us at the back end of the system here, or at the far end of the system, or whatever you want to look at, we're pretty unified about this proposition. And just because we live in the bush doesn't mean we're stupid or that don't have reasonably good educations and needs and expectations of a lifestyle and a need in our businesses. And believe me, we're ready to roll, and we have damn near total community consensus, up to some limitations as to what our percentage of participation can be, just depending on the size of the checkbook of our county, but we're committed. And I think it's just the communication gap of being heard and getting organized and making this a unified commitment.
Very good. Rick?
I might add that I think what's important for people is the significant application that they visualize themselves using. And that's what I think the power of the healthcare example, the power of the education example are those. They cover the spectrum, they impact everybody. The described healthcare example from Oakland that the chair described is replicated all over the country, and in fact is being done in Minnesota quite a bit with the rural areas. This is the one that's going to wake people up and say, I need to have the best doctor at the Mayo reading my ultrasound while I'm in the lodge. I don't want to drive to the clinic. I don't want to drive to Mayo, but I want the best services. And we can do that today. But you know, an ultrasound, reading it live, is one of the most comprehensive data streams you can get. And you can't do that at today's level. I'm not even sure you can get it at 4 megabits. So maybe you can get it at 10. There's reasons why we picked 10, because we looked at some of those applications. I think application will ultimately drive the use. But for a kid, they have the applications. That's easy. It's what about the adults? Is it email? Is it photos? Not compelling. Useful, but not compelling. It's not those things. But healthcare, revolutionizing that, revolutionizing education, that's important. We already heard you commented. How about Wi-Fi on the bus? Kids in the bus, 1 to 2 hours. I say no. How about you don't need the bus that much? You don't need the bus. The second highest cost in education is transportation. Let's put the transportation money, cut it in half. Give them classes over broadband half the time. Just half or a third. Pick your number. 1/3 of that savings, put it back into education. Change the way we do it. That's compelling. So those are 2 examples. And I think that, along with the comments that Bruce made, that's what's going to drive adoption. That's what's going to drive people all over, of all ilks, all professions, all needs to say, I want my town to have that.
Mr. Chairman, there's a question about public safety and 911 service, and the questioner wanted a little more focus on that.
Well, the need for an interoperable mobile public safety network for our first responders is just absolutely vital. We all know this, and yet since 9/11, we haven't made as much progress as a country on this as we should have.
I was telling you earlier the example of the St. Paul police officer who was killed, and unfortunately they apprehended the person that did it, but in the course of it, the number of police departments were brought in, and literally they had, I think it was 9 different walkie-talkies and cell phones. This was years ago. We've had great improvements in the metro area, not statewide, but in the metro area since then, but I thought it was a good example of the need for interoperability.
It's vital, and you know, we have now, as we're building out, as I said before, a commercial 4G mobile broadband network. To piggyback on that, invest in a broadband network for our first responders. If we do it at the same time, it'll be much, much less expensive for the country than if we wait. And we should do it in a way, and we've proposed a mechanism to do this. It's an interoperability center that we're calling ERIC, to make sure that as the public safety mobile broadband network gets built out, that it meets interoperability requirements so that we're actually building what we want as a country. But this is just vital, and now is the time to take advantage of this window of opportunity with the build out of the rest of the network to do it in a way that's efficient for the American people. Very
good. Well, I just wanted to give you a minute since you came all the way out here just to summarize where you think we should be going, the urgency. I can tell you there are a lot of questions about people want to get there. They don't want to keep losing ground. They want to get this done. They wonder why, why we've stumbled over the last few decades when we produce so many of these ideas, and how do we turn that around and move forward to be a leader again in the world.
Well, one of the things that I would encourage everyone here to keep in mind is, it's quite natural that at a broadband summit, we would get a lot of people who agree that broadband is a national priority, that we need to move toward the goals that we've been talking about here. But I do want you to know that that's not a uniform opinion in Washington or in our state governments. I'll give you one example. The FCC every year has to reach a conclusion by statute on whether broadband access in the United States is proceeding in a timely and reasonable way. And for the last several years, it's at least 4, but I can't remember when this provision was adopted, every year the FCC would look at that and say, yes, everything's fine. This year, when I had a chance to look at it with the staff of the FCC, I said, this is crazy. We see how other countries are moving. We see the challenges. The answer is no. We're not proceeding in the United States in a reasonable and timely way. And one would think, based on the conversation we've had here today, that would be unanimous. It would be without criticism. It would be something that everyone said, well, that's, of course. That was a 3-2 vote. And so what people in this room understand about the importance of broadband to small businesses, to our economy, to education, to healthcare, to public safety, is still, we're in the early innings in terms of having it really become a national priority. I'm here, Senator Klobuchar called this session to get this conversation going because this needs to spread and have more and more people understand that standing still is moving backwards. But I'm very pleased by this discussion. I'm very grateful to you, Senator, for hosting it. I thought the panelists were terrific. The questions were tough but fair. And I look forward to coming back to Minnesota.
Well, thank you. And we wanted to give you this opportunity to hear about some of the work that's going on here. But we also, like everyone around the country who's interested in this issue, are just grappling with how we go and we move quickly. And I liked Bruce's answer to that, actually, when he talked about the kids. I remember when I was on the campaign trail, I was at actually a radio station in St. Cloud, and my daughter happened to be sitting out there. She was about 11 years old at the time, and I was asked a question, and it was one of the few times I was completely stumped in the campaign with my daughter sitting right there. And the question was, do you know what LOL means? And now I do, but back then, okay, it was 4 years ago. Of course, it's laugh out loud, and I said, no, I have no idea. And so the radio guy told me what it was at the college radio station, and we got out of there, and she looked at me and she said, Mom, that is the single most embarrassing thing you've ever done in your life. And it reminded me again of how far ahead these kids are, and I think that we're seeing that kind of push on the grassroots level for these changes, but we're also seeing it, as Rick has pointed out and as Tim has pointed out, from the workers of America, from the business community, as we know we need to get to where we're going if we're going to continue to be a leader economically in this world. And so I guess that's what I'd leave you with, Mr. Chairman, from the state of Minnesota, is that we have always vigorous debates. We have one of the highest voter turnouts in the country. We're proud of that. But we also are unified on this idea, while people have different views of how we get there, that we must continue to move ahead technologically. So I want to thank you for joining us today. I hope some of our panelists can stay around, and Tim, you're going to stay around for those grant questions, so that we can continue to answer some of the individual questions that we didn't get to. Thank you very much for being here today.